It seems that in Thyatira, every single craft had a guild. So that means if you're not a member of the guild, you cannot do this work here. And here's how that creates a huge problem for believers. Every guild is going to have a patron god. So Athena is the patron goddess of weavers. Dionysus, if you're into wine. And Hephaestus, if you're some kind of a smith. Any given industry is going to have a god or goddess who is associated with it. And then there are going to be pagan rites and rituals that that guild does in honor of their patron. And you got to think, these people, they really believe this stuff. You're a winemaker, you own vineyards, and you got to do the celebration to Dionysus, which is basically a drunken orgy. I think before we move forward, we should just talk about Thyatira a little bit and the nature of the place. First off, it was a small town. It was the smallest of the seven, definitely. You've got some of the ancient commentators kind of mention it with disdain, like Thyatira and other unnoteworthy towns, or like other places that don't matter, basically. Like, who cares? It was basically established to guard Pergamum, because there was a point in history when Pergamum was the capital of the region, and Thyatira is further east in the same valley. And so an invader coming from the east would have to get past Thyatira to get to Pergamum. And so it was originally established really just to be like we'd rather this get sacked and attacked than the big, pretty nice town. So let's put an outpost there to try to hold enemies away from the good, rich stuff. So it had a military demeanor. Not that big a town. It did have a certain amount of wealth. For whatever reason, they produced a lot of purple, and purple was wildly expensive. One of the things that is super interesting, if you go to Aphrodisia, which is also in modern day Turkey, it's about an hour south of Colossae, sort of in that part of the neck of the woods. They unearthed there a price list from the time of Diocletian. So it's a couple hundred years later, but you still get pretty good relative scale. And one of the things it talks about is it just gives the value, like this costs this much and this costs that much, whatever. And a pound of purple cloth, of high quality purple cloth, was worth more than a pound of gold. And worth, I want to say, about 4 or 5 times the value of a healthy male slave. So it's worth more than 4 or 5 humans. Lydia, famously from the book of Acts, who meets Paul in Philippi, was a purveyor, a seller of purple cloth. So that means she was dealing in like high value luxury goods, basically, to really rich people. So Lydia was like super rich, but it says she was from Thyatira in Lydia. So Lydia's the region and her name, which is random information. So it may have been just a nickname for her. So she's rich, and she's from here. So it wasn't that it was economically bad off. They were doing just fine. All these towns are relatively wealthy. So they did have a lot of textile work, particularly in purple. They were the purple cloth maker. So that was sort of a big deal. But the other thing, that anytime they do digs around there, they find lots and lots of coins with guild insignia on them. So what that means is, more than any other town, certainly of its size, like it seems that in Thyatira, every single craft had a guild. And if you know anything about the guild system, basically it was a closed shop town. So that means if you're not a member of the guild, you cannot do this work here. And that system would get adopted widely in Europe in the Middle Ages for craftsmen and artisans, but it was definitely very, very strong in Thyatira. And here's how that creates a huge problem for believers. So every guild is going to have a patron god. So Athena is the patron goddess of weavers. So if you're in a textile guild, it's going to be Athena. Dionysus, if you're into wine. And Hephaestus, if you're some kind of a smith. And it kind of goes on and on, but you get the point. Any given industry is going to have a god or goddess who is associated with it. And then there are going to be pagan rites and rituals that that guild does in honor of their patron, god or goddess. And you got to think these people, they really believe this stuff. A lot of times we think they're kind of like modern European or secular Americans. They don't really, oh, this religion, we don't really, but they weren't like that at all. They really believed in this stuff. And they believed in scary gods and goddesses who were very easily angered. And it was a very superstitious sort of form of religion. And so if you make the god or goddess angry, they might smite you. They might do something to you. So you can't not worship them. And so, let's say maybe you're in the winemakers guild, and a bunch of people become Christians and they stop worshiping Dionysus, and then there is some sort of blight, or the rains don't come one year, or whatever, production drops. Then all the people who still do worship Dionysus are going to see, y'all did this. You stopped worshiping him and he's mad at us. And if you believe like that, then opting out is not voluntary. No, you must participate. And if you don't participate, if you don't honor the god, then you're kicked out. And then you can't do that work. You're banned. And so there is a heavy, heavy, heavy pressure on people, economic pressure on Christian believers in Thyatira to participate in the guild system. But that means you've got to participate in the pagan religion. So you can imagine all sorts of variations of this. So first off, 3 or 4 times a year, you're going to have a festival to your god or goddess. You're a winemaker, you own vineyards, and you got to do the celebration to Dionysus, which is basically a drunken orgy. So are you going to go participate in something that's just clearly, clearly sinful? Or you're clearly doing things that are way out of bounds for a Christian believer.
How do you think, some context like that, like fits in with like in Corinthians, like food sacrificed to idols? Like, because
Yeah.
the food sacrificed to idols was also part of their. I mean, I know we talked about it when we were there, where they would be butchering this meat, and then,
Mm-hmm.
but it was part of the spiritual thing they were doing there, and he's basically
Right.
telling them, hey, if you're gonna, you can eat it. It's just meat, but like make sure that you're not like hindering someone else's spiritual.
Well, it's honestly it's complex biblically, and it's something that I my understanding of it, I definitely hold it open handedly, and I'm totally willing to be corrected on it. But this is the best I understand it. So if you read Paul and you read the book of Revelation, so Jesus speaking through John, it really kind of sounds contradictory because Paul kind of says, don't ask, don't tell. Like, if it offends your brother, don't do it. But, they're just fake things. They don't really have much power. Kind of do what you want. Just do all to the glory of God and, whatever.
Don't
It's
sin,
more,
basically.
yeah, and it's more about not offending somebody. So if somebody really has a problem with it, don't do it around them. But really, it doesn't matter. It basically seems to be Paul's take on it. But then you've got Jesus in this letter saying, like, I'm really mad at you because you tolerate this woman who tells people they can do this, sin sexually, and eat meat offered to idols. It's like Jesus throws them in the same basket. So you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Why is this so harshly condemned now if it was a little bit of a softer thing with Paul? And this is what I think he's talking about, 2 different practices. So I think what Paul is talking about when he has a little bit of a more lenient interpretation is meat being sold in a market, but you kind of know the butcher did some sort of thing over it for their god before they killed the animal.
Oh, okay.
Or you're in Corinth and the temple of Apollo is literally right up the hill, right next to the meat market. And, a few times a year they kill 50 or 100 bulls the same day. And in a place where meat is usually very expensive, since they don't have refrigeration, on certain days it gets real cheap for a minute, because they're all floating a bunch. And it's one of your few chances to get some high quality protein cheaply in a world where meat was a more luxury than it is now. And so people wanted to buy it, need it. And
So
it
that
definitely,
does make sense. It's a little bit different because the meat sacrifice to idols is more like a byproduct of the They're sacrificing it, but then they're not cooking it all right there. He's saying you could buy the meat and not do the worship part, right?
yeah. So I think that's what Paul's referring to. It's being sold in a market, but it was offered to an idol. I
Right.
think what Jesus is referring to here is you're eating it at a quote unquote like a love festival, to whether it's again to like Aphrodite be a love festival, but whatever, or a Bacchanalia festival
Hmm.
to Dionysus. You're actually participating in the feast to the god or goddess. And I think this is what Jesus is saying. No, you cannot do this.
So that's more like, yeah, that's like almost like you're joining in the worship experience. Kind
Absolutely.
of like when Paul's correcting the Corinthians of like, stop going to see, I know you're Christians, stop going to see prostitutes. Be
Yeah.
united with just one spouse.
Yeah.
He's basically telling them, yeah.
Well, because in defense of the early Christians, it was really tough. You might bump into somebody you haven't seen in a long time, and they would dump out a little bit of their wine as a libation. They're pouring out like to the god of whatever, and then they're like offer you a drink. And so like they just offered some of their wine to whatever god or goddess they served, but they did it in thanks that they saw you for the first time in 10 years. And if you're like, no way, or are you like, oh, what's it matter? You know? And they had to decide, does it matter or not? Was that where I draw a line? Or again, my kids are getting married, but they're getting married at the temple to Apollo. Do you want to come? And so then you have to decide. Do I want to say, no, I don't go to pagan temples and offend your brother who's marrying his daughter off? It was tough for them to figure out where to draw these lines. You want to love God and love people, and you don't want to be unnecessarily offensive, but you also can't deny Christ, and you can't participate in pagan worship. So figuring out how to denote all of that, I think, was far more difficult for them than we know. But I mean, we have situations that are probably equally thorny these days that are similar stuff when you get into maybe like sex and gender and things like that, where you get invited somewhere you're not sure what you're supposed to do about it, and then you have to figure out where to draw that line. So they were under great pressure to sort of participate in what was going on locally, which definitely involved clearly immoral behavior. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. If you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandofthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.